give us a little spending money. I checked you out. You're rich, aren't you?
Stop! I called 911.
What part of your brain made you walk in here, girl? Who do you think you are?
At 10 at night, the small apartment in South Dallas had only one yellow light left on over the kitchen. Diane Carter stood in front of the refrigerator, one hand holding a nearly empty carton of milk, the other holding her phone to check the time. On the refrigerator door, Jordan's tuition bill for next month was pinned beneath a star-shaped magnet. The amount wasn't large to many people, but it was enough to make Diane look at it every morning like a question that refused to disappear. She had just picked Jordan up from Mrs. Ellis, the downstairs neighbor who still watched him after school for less than any service in the neighborhood. Jordan was 9, thin, bright-eyed, always trying to act like he wasn't sleepy when his mother came late. He didn't complain about reheated dinner. He didn't ask why his mother wore a dark blue uniform while other mothers were already home in pajamas. Children raised beside Bill's learned to read the air early. Diane reheated the noodles left in the pot, sat beside her son at the kitchen table, and listened as Jordan told her half a story about science class. He said they were learning about Mars, and if people lived there, they would need domes, air, water, and somebody who knew how to fix everything when it broke. Diane smiled and said that person probably didn't get much sleep. Jordan laughed, then yawned right in the middle of his sentence. She took him to his room, pulled the blanket up to his shoulders, then picked up the book they had been reading from the shelf. They only had half a chapter left, but the wall clock was already moving close to 10:20. Diane's night shift started at 11 at an office building near Deep Ellum. She read anyway. Her voice was low and even enough to make Jordan feel like the night wasn't being cut in half by the sound of the door closing and his mother's footsteps leaving. When Jordan fell asleep, Diane sat on the edge of the bed for a few more seconds. She looked at his face in the dark, at a curl stuck to his forehead, then at the clock. 20 minutes left. Just enough time to change shoes, lock the door, go down the stairs, catch the bus, and hope the night route wasn't late. She turned off the light, but before she left the kitchen, her eyes hit the tuition bill again. Not paid, no idea where the money would come from, only the certainty that tomorrow she still had to work. Diane's security uniform hung behind the door. The dark blue shirt was faded at the cuffs, the name badge reading Diane Carter, Apex Security Services. She smoothed the front of the shirt, tied her hair into a low bun, slipped her earbuds into her pocket, then opened her wallet. Inside were a few small bills, Jordan's library card, a gas discount coupon, and exactly the amount she had counted over and over, enough to put a little gas in the car after her shift if she didn't have to buy anything else. By the time she reached Deep Ellum, the city had changed its voice. Painted brick walls, bright bar entrances, music spilling onto the sidewalks. Diane sat inside the small guard booth, watching cameras, logging cars in and out, and checking the back door. Her shift wasn't hard in the way outsiders understood hard. The hard part was staying alert when everyone else had allowed themselves to drift. At 1:12 in the morning, the street started to thin out. Diane closed the logbook after her third round, rinsed weak coffee from a cup in the tiny sink, then checked her phone. Jordan hadn't texted. That was good. If he was awake, it was usually because of a nightmare or because he had heard an ambulance passing somewhere far off. At 1:19, she left the guard booth to check the side door. The rear camera recorded her shadow crossing the hallway, keys in hand, a small flashlight clipped to her belt. According to the procedure manual, an officer wasn't supposed to leave the booth for long without reporting it. But the emergency section also said security staff could intervene nearby if there was a direct threat to life or property. Diane had read that line. Sandra Briggs, her manager, would later read it too, looking for a way to turn it against her. Diane heard the impact against the wall just as she got near the alley between the building and the rear parking lot. It wasn't a bottle breaking. It wasn't some drunk kicking a trash can. It was the sound of a body hitting brick, heavy and short. She stopped. She had only one earbud in, and the song in it suddenly felt far away. She looked around the corner. 3 men stood in the alley. A white man in a suit had been forced against the wall, his tie loose, his jacket rumpled, one shoulder slammed into the brick. His phone was in one man's hand. His wallet was being searched by another. The man tried to stay calm, but his hands were shaking. Not fake fear. The kind of fear that comes when someone realizes for the first time that money, calendars, and titles don't mean anything in a dark alley at 123. Diane looked around. The street was empty. The last place down the block had already closed. The rear parking lot only had a few cars scattered through it. She could backed away, locked the side door, called the police from the booth, and written in the log that she had followed procedure. No one could faulted her for not stepping between 3 strange men. She knew that. Diane took out her phone and called 911. Her voice with the dispatcher was calmer than her heart. She gave the address clearly and described 3 suspects, 1 male victim, and a robbery that could escalate. She kept the phone in her hand, put it on speaker, and stepped into the alley. She was afraid. Fear ran down her back and made her palm damp inside the thin glove. She thought about Jordan sleeping at home, about the tuition bill on the refrigerator, and about the fact that if she got hurt, no one would read the rest of that half chapter to her son tomorrow night. But her feet kept moving, not because she didn't understand the danger. Because some people have been trained by life to cover others before they have time to calculate. She called out. All three men turned. Diane stood straight, empty-handed, her dark blue security uniform clear under the yellow light at the end of the alley. She said the police were on the way, that the address was already in a 911 call, and that she had seen all three of their faces. One of them laughed, looked at her hands, and said she didn't have a gun. Diane stepped in front of the man trapped against the wall, placing her body between him and them. She admitted she didn't have a gun. But she had an open call, an address, descriptions, and 45 seconds if they still valued their freedom. No one moved for 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds were longer than her whole night shift. Diane heard the man breathing behind her. Heard the closest robber tighten his grip on the wallet. Heard the dispatcher ask if she was safe. She didn't answer. She only kept her eyes on the three faces in front of her, memorizing every detail like she was writing a report. Gray hoodie, white shoes with mud on them, a scratch on one cheekbone, and a tattoo on the left wrist. Then the man holding the phone cursed under his breath and stepped back first. The other two followed. They didn't run right away. They backed away a few steps, as if they didn't want to admit a woman in a security uniform had made them hesitate. When they disappeared from the mouth of the alley, Diane still didn't turn around. She waited. Waited until their footsteps dissolved into the street. Waited until the distant police siren started cutting through the leftover music of Deep Ellum. The white man looked at her like he still couldn't decide whether she was real or only a reaction to panic. His lip was slightly split, and his suit still had brick dust on it. He asked what she had just done. Diane looked toward the street, guessed where the police car was, and answered briefly that she had done her job. He wanted to say more, but she had already picked his phone off the alley floor, handed it back, and pointed toward the street. The police were here. He needed to stay and give his statement. When he asked about her, Diane remembered the gas gauge, remembered Jordan, remembered that her booth had been empty too long. She said she still had to get gas. Then she turned away before he could ask her name. The police car had just turned onto the street when Diane crossed the parking lot. While pushing the man back from the corner earlier, one robber's fingernail had caught her elbow, leaving a small scratch. It stung, but not enough to call it an injury. Things that don't seem worth mentioning are often the things poor people learn to ignore. Close to 3 a.m, Diane got home. The apartment stairwell creaked lightly under her shoes. She opened the door as quietly as she could, hoping Jordan was asleep. But the boy was sitting at the kitchen table in an old t-shirt, messy-haired, with a cup of water in front of him. He hadn't turned on the big light, only the little kitchen light. Diane saw him, and her heart sank from exhaustion. Jordan asked why she was home so late. Diane hung up her keys and said there had been a little thing. She washed her hands at the sink, the water running over the scratch and making the skin sting. Jordan saw it. His eyes stayed on his mother's elbow longer than a child's eyes should, but he didn't ask. He had learned that when his mother said a little thing, it meant the story might have to wait until rent, tuition, and breakfast weren't all asking questions at the same time. Diane took a bidet from the drawer and stuck it on carelessly. She took Jordan back to his room and sat beside him until he agreed to lie down. Near dawn, Diane could still hear the man's question in the alley. What the hell did she just do? She didn't know how to answer it except in the simplest way. She saw someone about to get hurt and she stepped in between. Saturday morning, her phone rang at 8:06. Sandra Briggs wanted to see her at the Apex office before noon. The woman's voice didn't sound like a question. It sounded like a conclusion waiting for paperwork. Apex Security Services sat in a low strip mall, its glass door covered with a fading logo. Sandra sat behind her desk, straightened hair, thin-framed glasses, a brown blazer. She didn't ask if Diane was hurt. She didn't ask what had happened. She turned her computer screen so Diane could see the camera clip from 119, Diane leaving the guard booth. Another corner of the screen showed when she returned. 11 minutes. Sandra said Diane had abandoned her post for 11 minutes. Serious violation. Diane explained there had been a robbery in the alley, that she had called 911, that the victim could have been beaten if she hadn't stepped in. Sandra listened the way someone listens to a printer running. When Diane finished, she only repeated that procedure was procedure. If the building had been broken into during those 11 minutes, Apex would have been liable. In Sandra's eyes, the man in the alley was an outside factor. The empty guard station was the main data point. Diane sat straight. She didn't want to beg for doing the right thing, but she also knew that being right wouldn't pay Jordan's tuition if she lost her job. Sandra placed an official warning on the desk. One more violation would lead to termination. Diane read every line and saw how much cleaner everything looked on paper than it had in real life. No sound of a body hitting a wall, no dark alley, no 3 men, just an employee leaving her post without authorization. She signed. Meanwhile, Nicholas Hart sat in a private hotel suite in downtown Dallas, staring at the wallet with the scratch corner on the table. He had given his statement to the police, gotten his phone back, canceled his credit cards, and told his assistant he was fine about 12 times. But the one thing he couldn't answer was the name of the woman who had stood in front of him. The police report listed the victim, Nicholas Hart. The direct witness section was almost blank. A female security guard had called 911 but left the scene before giving a statement. Nicholas asked his assistant to pull nearby camera footage. He needed to know that woman was real, and he needed to know why she could walk away as if she had just done something normal. By afternoon, his assistant sent him a blurry image from a parking lot camera. Across the back of the dark blue uniform was the logo of Apex Security Services. At the Apex offices, Diane left Sandra's room with the warning folded in her hand. She stepped into the old elevator, the metal doors closing slowly with a shake. In the dull mirror, she saw her own face. Tired eyes, hair tied tight, dry lips, a Band-Aid on her elbow, a uniform that had been washed too many times. She didn't cry. Crying would make her eyes swell before the evening shift. Jordan would notice, and she didn't have enough strength left to explain something she still didn't know how to name. The elevator dropped floor by floor. Diane looked straight into the mirror, holding the warning paper. One more step, and she would lose her job. Jordan would lose insurance, lose his after-school program, lose everything she had been trying to hold together with night shifts. The strangest part was that she didn't regret it. 3 days after the night in Deep Ellum, Nicholas Hart walked into the Apex Security Services office without warning. He didn't come with bodyguards. He didn't have an assistant call ahead. He didn't use his name to open the door. He only parked his rented sedan outside the low strip mall, straightened the collar of the shirt he had been wearing since his morning meeting, and walked through the glass door with the blue and silver security logo. The receptionist looked up before the door chime had even faded. Her eyes moved from his Italian leather shoes to his charcoal gray suit, then stopped at the watch on his wrist. She asked what he needed, her voice polite but careful. Nicholas didn't hand her a business card. He only asked who had been responsible for the night shift in the Deep Ellum area last Friday night. The question made the receptionist pause. She looked toward the office door inside, then picked up the desk phone and called the manager. Nicholas stood still in the small waiting area, in front of a wall covered with safety certificates, policy notices, and photos of employees in uniform. That night, she had only appeared to him as a back in a dark blue uniform standing between him and 3 men. Passed out in under 2 minutes. She was around 50, with neatly cut hair, thin-framed glasses, and a brown suit severe enough to speak for her title. She looked at Nicholas like someone preparing to receive a complaint from a client who could damage a contract. The first thing she did was invite him into her private office, where files were stacked in neat piles, and a procedure manual sat right on the edge of the desk. Nicholas sat down, but he didn't lean back. He recognized this kind of atmosphere. A small room, hard chairs, a manager using forms to turn every living story into an operational mistake. Sandra spoke first, saying Apex always valued feedback about service quality. He wasn't there to complain. He only said he wanted the name of the security officer who had worked the night shift at the building near the Deep Ellum alley around 1 a.m. on Friday. Sandra placed her hand on the file in front of her. Her hesitation was tiny, but Nicholas caught it. She said the matter was being handled internally, that there had been a violation involving leaving a post, and that the company couldn't share employee information casually during a disciplinary process. The word disciplinary made Nicholas sit straighter. That night, he had heard her call 911, seen her step into the alley when no one else stopped, felt her body clearly shielding his while the 3 robbers were still within reach. In Sandra's file, that had become leaving a post without authorization. He said briefly that the security officer had done the right thing. Then he placed his hand on the desk and added, slowly, that he was the person she had helped. Sandra's face changed color. She looked again at the suit, the watch, the way he spoke, and realized the incident might not be just an internal discipline matter anymore. Someone Diane had saved could have a voice, and this person didn't look like an ordinary passerby. Nicholas finally handed her his business card. Just a thick cream-colored card, his name, Nicholas Hart, and beneath it, Hart Hospitality Group. Sandra looked at the card longer than necessary. She didn't say billionaire, but the small room immediately gained a different kind of weight. In her life as a manager, Sandra understood very well the difference between a worker explaining and a CEO client confirming. Her voice softened. She said there may have been a misunderstanding about the context, but Nicholas hadn't come to listen to her change tone. He wanted the name. Sandra opened the employee file, flipped through several pages, then read it out. Diane Carter, night shift security officer, contracted through Apex, assigned to the Deep Ellum area, received an official warning Saturday morning. One more step would lead to termination. The name settled in Nicholas's ear like the final piece dropping into place. Diane Carter. The woman who had disappeared before he could ask her name because she still had to get gas. He asked if she was on shift. Sandra said Diane had just finished a morning relief shift at another building and would be coming by the office to turn in her log. Nicholas immediately stood. Sandra started to say she would call Diane in, but he refused. He didn't want Diane summoned like an employee forced to explain herself in front of an important client. He went out to wait in the lobby. The Apex office had nothing luxurious about it. The vinyl chairs were cracked at the corners, the vending machine by the door gave off a low hum, and the smell of old coffee mixed with printer paper. Nicholas sat in the chair near the door, both hands on his knees, realizing he was nervous in a strange way. He was used to people looking for him, used to smiles measured by usefulness. This time, he was the one waiting. Diane walked in at 11:36, still in her security uniform, hair in a low bun, eyes tired from a morning shift stacked on top of the night before. She held a paper log, and the small Band-Aid on one elbow was starting to peel at the edge. When she saw Nicholas, she stopped in the doorway. There was only the caution of someone who had learned that when rich people showed up at your workplace, it rarely made life easier. Nicholas stood. He had thought he would say thank you first or apologize because she had gotten in trouble. But the first thing that came out of his mouth was that he had spent 3 days trying to find her. Diane looked at him for 1 second, then said he didn't have to do that. The answer wasn't cold. It was tired. As if she had already had to tell the whole world. Don't make a big thing out of it. I don't have time to be turned into a story. Nicholas said he knew, and that was exactly why he had done it. That made Diane look at him a little longer. Not with trust. Not yet. But at least she heard that his voice didn't carry the familiar tone of someone giving charity. Sandra stood in the office doorway, watching. Diane noticed immediately. She placed the log on the reception counter and kept her back straight. Nicholas asked if they could talk for a few minutes. Diane looked at the clock on the wall. She had to get home, sleep for 2 hours, pick up Jordan, make dinner, and then go back to the night shift. But she also understood that if she refused in front of Sandra, the woman would record it as another kind of uncooperative attitude. Diane nodded. They stood in the corner of the lobby, not private enough but far enough from the reception desk. Nicholas thanked her. The thank you came out clumsier than he wanted because no business language was good enough for the fact that a stranger had stood in front of him in a dark alley. Diane only nodded and said the police came, so it was over. But in Nicholas's life, it wasn't over. Since that night, every time he walked through a polished hotel hallway, he saw the dark alley still left behind him. He saw a woman who probably didn't have more than a few small bills in her wallet stepping in front of him as if his life were worth protecting just as much as anybody else's. He took an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. Diane saw it, and her face closed immediately. Nicholas noticed. He spoke before she had to and said it wasn't cash. But she still shook her head. She hadn't done it for money. Money from a stranger is never just money for women like her. It can become judgment, debt, or someone else's story about your kindness. Nicholas didn't argue. He said he knew, so he wasn't only handing her money. He opened the envelope, took out a personal card, and placed it on the small table beside the waiting chair. On it was his direct phone number, not through his assistant, not through the office. He said there were no conditions attached. If she needed a witness, a statement, or just someone to prove she hadn't left her post for no reason, she could call. Diane didn't take the card. Her hand stayed at her side, her thumb lightly touching the edge of her uniform. She looked at his name, but the name Nicholas Hart didn't fully mean anything to her yet. To Diane, he was still the man from the alley, wrinkled suit, unsteady breathing, asking what the hell she had just done. The fact that he had a nice business card only made her more careful. Nicholas left the card there. He didn't push it closer. He didn't promise to fix everything in one day. He only said she had saved him from something that could have been much worse, and he didn't want her paying for that alone. Then he left the office before gratitude turned into pressure. Diane stood there for a while after he was gone. Sandra stepped out, her voice softer than it had been Saturday morning, but Diane didn't mistake that softness for fairness. A manager only changes volume when she knows someone powerful is listening. The card still sat on the table. Diane looked at it like a door she wasn't sure led anywhere safe. Finally, she picked it up, slipped it into her shirt pocket, and left Apex. That afternoon, Nicholas returned to his high-floor office at Hart Hospitality Group. Through the glass-walled Dallas lay under the late sun like a map of things he partly owned. Hotels, resorts, restaurants, land projects along highways. Everything in his office was designed to control risk. And yet that Friday night, just because he had been angry after an argument with his assistant about always being escorted, he had walked alone for a few blocks and discovered that real life didn't care about his schedule. He opened the camera footage his assistant had gathered. The image was blurry, filmed from a distance, with no clear audio. He saw himself being shoved against the wall, saw Diane appear at the edge of the frame. She stopped for one beat, made a call, then stepped into the alley. No one was behind her. Nothing was in her hand except the phone. The footage couldn't show the fear on her face, but Nicholas remembered clearly how her whole body tightened as she stood in front of the three robbers. His assistant, Malcolm, entered after knocking. Malcolm had worked with Nicholas for 9 years, long enough to know when his boss was staring at a report for reasons that weren't about the report. He asked what Nicholas planned to do with the woman. It was a practical question, not a cruel one. If it was a legal issue, Hart Hospitality had a team for that. If it was compensation, they could send a check through Apex. If it was media, they could turn it into a good story for local news. Nicholas didn't look away from the screen. He said he wanted to know that the woman was real. Malcolm didn't understand. Nicholas didn't explain further. How could he explain to the man who had managed his schedule for almost a decade that what had shaken him wasn't just being saved? It was being saved by someone who had no idea what he had. She had only seen a man trapped in a corner and stepped forward. Nicholas's whole life was surrounded by relationships with hidden clauses. Friends wanted investments. Partners wanted access. Former lovers wanted schedules that worked for publicity. Employees wanted him satisfied. Even kindness usually came wrapped in some kind of benefit. That was the world he had been born into and raised in. And that was why Diane's action felt like a slit of light cutting through thick glass. No negotiation. No introduction. No staying to collect credit. Nicholas replayed the footage. Once again, Diane stepped into the alley. In South Dallas, Diane got home before sunset. Jordan was doing homework at the kitchen table, one foot hooked over the chair rung, a pencil held between his lips. Diane set her bag down and took the card from her pocket, still not sure whether she should keep it or throw it away. She placed it on the table beside her keys, planning to put it in a drawer later and forget it. Jordan saw it first. He asked whose it was. Diane said it was someone she met at work. The way she said it was too short, and Jordan looked closer. He picked up the card and slowly read the name Nicholas Hart. Diane was washing dishes with her back turned. Jordan took his mother's old phone from the corner of the table where it was charging and opened the browser. Diane heard typing but didn't turn around right away. She thought he was looking something up for homework. When the kitchen stayed too quiet for too long, she finally glanced over her shoulder. Jordan was sitting very straight, eyes fixed on the screen. The first result showed Nicholas Hart, CEO of Hart Hospitality Group. A photo of him in a dark suit standing in front of a hotel more than 10 stories tall, the company's gold logo behind him. Beneath it were lines about the largest hotel chain in Texas, estimated net worth, business interviews, and charity lists. Jordan looked at the photo, then at his mother standing by the sink with her sleeves rolled up, water on her wrists, and shoulders tired from lack of sleep. In the boy's mind, the man on the card and a little thing at 3 a.m. suddenly fit together. Diane didn't say anything. Jordan didn't ask either. But from that second on, the small kitchen held one more truth Diane hadn't fully understood yet. The mother, who had been warned for leaving her guard booth, had shielded one of the richest men in Texas, and she was still washing dishes like tomorrow was just another night shift. Monday morning began with an email that had no exclamation point, but a sentence that sounded like a threat but still made Diane Carter sit for a long time in front of her phone screen inside Apex small break room. The subject line only said, "Request for supplemental Deep Ellum incident records." Below it, the insurance company for the building where she had worked the night shift wanted to review all logs, camera footage, access reports, and the reason the officer left the post at 1:19 in the morning. Those words were clean in a cruel way. They didn't know the smell of the damp alley. They didn't know the sound of a man's back hitting the wall. They didn't know what it felt like to stand empty-handed in front of 3 men deciding whether a woman in a security uniform was worth hitting. They only knew a guard post had been empty for 11 minutes. Sandra Briggs called Diane into her office at the end of the morning. This time, there wasn't only the warning on the desk. There was also a thicker stack of documents, a red paper clip on the corner with a letter from the insurance company on top. Sandra wasn't angry. She was more dangerous when she wasn't angry, because every sentence sounded as if it had been pulled from a handbook instead of a heart. Diane sat in front of the desk, both hands resting on her knees. Sandra said the matter had moved beyond an internal warning. If the insurance side concluded that Apex had allowed an employee to leave her post outside procedure, the contract could be reviewed. So she was recommending that the company begin the termination process to protect itself from continuing risk. Diane heard the word termination and immediately saw Jordan's face at the kitchen table. Losing the job wouldn't just mean losing a paycheck. Apex was the only place in the last 2 years that had still given her basic health insurance, so Jordan could keep his asthma appointments. He didn't have attacks often, but every cold season, Diane kept one inhaler in his backpack and another on top of the refrigerator. If the insurance disappeared, every appointment would become a new calculation: medicine, gas, school, electricity, which one got paid first and which one had to wait. Sandra kept talking about responsibility, company image, and how personal kindness couldn't replace procedures designed to protect client property. The way she used the word kindness almost made Diane laugh from the tightness in her throat, as if she had stepped into that alley to prove she was kind on camera, as if human beings should only save each other after they had filled out the right form. Diane explained again. She said she had called 911 before leaving the booth, had observed the area, had assessed a direct threat to a person's life within her assigned zone. She tried to keep her voice calm, not for Sandra but for herself. If she got angry, the file would say attitude. If she cried, the file would say emotional. If she stayed quiet, the file would say no response. Poor people, when they're judged by paperwork, usually lose no matter how they react. Sandra listened until the end, then said she didn't care about the personal reason. Procedure was procedure. Diane looked at the stack of red-clipped papers in front of her and understood that in this room, the 3 robbers no longer existed. The man trapped against the wall didn't exist. The 911 call was only a secondary detail if it made the report look better. The clearest thing that existed was a night shift employee leaving her chair for 11 minutes. On her way out of Sandra's office, Diane passed the internal hiring board and saw a flyer for an evening paralegal course. It made her think of the old law scholarship, the one she had once kept in a drawer with her acceptance letter before her husband left and Jordan was still red-faced in a crib. She had once thought she would learn how to argue in court, how to read the clauses other people use to scare poor people. Then life shrank down into bottles, rent, night shifts, and bus rides before sunrise. Now, cruelly enough, she was being beaten by a procedure manual, while the deepest part of her still knew she had read it right. But knowing you're right doesn't mean you have enough strength to prove it alone. By afternoon, Nicholas Hart called. Diane was home, standing by the sink, washing Jordan's lunchbox while the boy did homework at the kitchen table. She saw the unknown number on the screen and immediately recognized the card. She didn't want to answer. Not because she was afraid of him, but because she didn't know where to place him in her life. The man from the alley. The man rich enough for Jordan to find a long page about him on Google. The man who could make Sandra change her tone with one business card. Jordan looked up when the ringing dragged on. Diane saw him watching her, and she didn't want her son to learn one more lesson about his mother being afraid even to answer a phone call. She wiped her hands on a towel, stepped closer to the window, and picked up. Nicholas said he had heard she was in trouble because of that night. Diane asked where he had heard that, though she could guess. He said he had someone at Apex. That sentence made her go quiet. For someone like Nicholas, having someone somewhere was normal. For Diane, it sounded like a door rich people always knew how to open while people like her stood outside, reading the rules. She told him not to interfere. He didn't ask in an offended voice. He only asked why. Diane looked down at her hands, her fingers still wet with dishwater, her nails cut short because of work. She said she didn't want favors. She only wanted fairness. That sentence made both ends of the line go quiet for a moment. It wasn't a full refusal, it was a boundary, and Nicholas, maybe for the first time in years, didn't step over that boundary just because he could. He said he understood. Diane wasn't sure he truly did, but his voice didn't rush to correct her. He only said if she needed a witness, he would be there. She thanked him very quietly, not warm enough to invite more, not cold enough to end it. When she hung up, Jordan was still looking at her. The boy didn't ask right away. He waited until Diane put the plate on the rack, wiped the counter, and opened the refrigerator as if there were an answer inside for next month's tuition. Then Jordan asked if the man on the card was the person she had helped in the alley. Diane turned around. For 1 second, she saw that her son was no longer just a child who listened to half a chapter before bed. He had learned how to search grown-up names, how to read his mother's face, how to put pieces of silence together. She asked how he knew. Jordan said he looked him up on Google. Diane wanted to scold him, but she didn't have the strength. Jordan said, "He's really rich, Mom." His voice wasn't greedy. It was only surprised in the way children are surprised when they realize the person their mother saved in an alley can also be the man standing in front of tall hotels on a screen. Diane said that didn't matter. Jordan looked at her like he wanted to believe her but couldn't yet. He said the man had found her. That sentence stayed in the kitchen longer than its sound. Diane didn't have an easy answer. Her whole life, she had been used to fighting alone before anyone had time to ask if she needed help. Having someone search for her, especially someone who could actually help, didn't make her feel relieved right away. It made her cautious. If you were Diane, knowing the man you shielded was a billionaire who wanted to help you, would you let him step in or would you keep fighting alone? Some people don't refuse because they're proud. They refuse because they've lived too long in a world where every kind of help can turn into a rope around their wrists. And sometimes what they need most isn't a favor, but a witness willing to speak the truth with them. At Apex, Jerome Harris sat alone in the monitoring room, replaying the footage from Friday night. He was 38, had worked many shifts in the same area as Diane, and knew she wasn't the kind of person who left a post to make personal calls or nap in a storage room. He also knew Sandra was building the file in the direction most convenient for the company. But knowing and speaking were two different things. On the screen, Diane left the booth at 1:19. On the alley audio channel, the sound of impact against the wall appeared exactly 2 seconds before that, followed by a man's muffled cry. Jerome rewound it. Then again, he opened the emergency call log recorded by the system because Diane had called 911 from a personal device inside the assigned area. The timeline was clear, the noise, Diane standing up, the 911 call, and then she left the booth. If the handbook was read correctly, this wasn't abandoning a post. This was a response to a dangerous situation inside the nearby zone. Jerome pulled open the desk drawer and took out the old Apex procedure manual. In the field security section, there was a line everyone learned during training, but almost nobody repeated when they needed to discipline someone else. An officer had the right to intervene or move away from a fixed post when there was a direct threat to life within the assigned radius, as long as an emergency notification had been activated if possible. Diane had done every part right. He printed the timestamp, then stopped before making another copy. On the monitoring room wall was the shift calendar. Sandra approved his overtime. His wife was 6 months pregnant. They had just signed a new lease. If he went against Sandra, she could cut his hours, move him to a farther site, or simply make every workday uncomfortable enough that he quit on his own. Jerome looked at the paper in the printer tray, knew it could help Diane, then turned it face down on the desk. That evening, Nicholas sat in his private office with a copy of the police report. He didn't wait for an assistant to summarize it. He read every line. 1:23 a.m., 911 call from a personal number, female caller, confirmed address, described 3 suspects and 1 male victim. Area camera showed a security officer from the adjacent building entering the alley after receiving an unusual audio cue. He set his pen beside that section and underlined it twice. Malcolm found the Apex procedure manual through a service contract one of Hart's hotels had used with him before. Nicholas read the fixed post duty section, then the emergency exception. The line sat there so clearly it made him angry. Diane hadn't only done the humanly right thing. She had a procedural basis for doing it, and yet Sandra was still using that same procedure like a knife. Nicholas emailed legal counsel, but he didn't send anything to Diane yet. He remembered what she had said. She didn't want a favor, only fairness. So he didn't prepare a rescue scene. He prepared documents. If she decided to fight, he wouldn't stand in front of her like a man buying her problem. He would stand behind her as a witness. At home, Diane opened her old laptop after Jordan fell asleep. The screen had a bright damaged streak in the left corner and the battery was dead, so it had to stay plugged in. The email from Apex HR arrived at 8:42. Subject, notice of formal hearing. Monday, 9 a.m. The message was short, informing Diane that she had the right to present her account, but if the panel found a serious violation, her contract would be terminated within 7 days. She read it once, then a second time. By the third time, the words on the screen began to blur. Not because of tears, but because she was too tired. Diane closed the laptop. The kitchen was quiet. On the refrigerator, next month's tuition bill still sat beneath the star-shaped magnet. Jordan had circled a date on the calendar with colored pencil because it was science fair day at school. She wondered whether she would still have enough money for model supplies if she lost the job. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Nicholas appeared, simple and not long. Do you want to talk? Diane looked at the message for a long time. In her head was Sandra's voice saying procedure was procedure, the insurance letter. Jerome lowered his percent in the monitoring room, though Diane didn't know that yet. Jordan says he found you. The man in the alley standing behind her, too scared to pretend otherwise, showed up at Apex 3 days later just to say she had done the right thing. She didn't want to be saved, but she also didn't want to lose to a lie printed on company paper. Her finger touched the screen. She deleted one answer that was too cold, then another that was too tired. Finally, she only typed 2 words. What time? The message was sent. Diane set the phone down and sat in the small kitchen, allowing herself, for the first time, to think that maybe fairness didn't have to be something she carried alone. Sunday night, Diane Carter arrived at the small coffee shop in Oak Cliff 10 minutes early. She didn't want to look like someone who had agreed to meet and then made the other person wait. The shop sat between a laundromat and an old auto parts store. Inside, it smelled of over-roasted coffee, plastic-wrapped pastries, and lemon floor cleaner. Diane had chosen this place, not one of Nicholas Hart's hotels, not a restaurant where someone pulled out your chair, not a space that would make her wonder whether she had worn the wrong shirt. She sat very still near the window, her back to the wall, out of the habit of a security officer. On the phone in front of her, the words formal hearing were still there, black neat, with no room for the feeling of a mother losing sleep over her son's health insurance. Nicholas walked in exactly on time. He wore a light blue shirt, dark pants, no tie, and no bright watch. Diane noticed that it was intentional. He ordered black coffee without giving his name to the cashier, then came to her table with a stack of papers clipped inside a manila folder. He didn't open with a promise. That made Diane loosen a little. He placed the papers on the table and turned them toward her. They were printouts from the Apex Procedure Manual, the section on fixed post responsibilities, along with the emergency exception page. One line had been marked in yellow. An officer may leave a post to intervene in a direct threat within a 50-meter radius, if emergency notification has been activated when possible. Diane looked at the line. She knew that clause. She had read it during training, had remembered it when she heard the impact against the wall, had relied on it when she stepped into the alley. Nicholas didn't act surprised. He only asked very gently why she hadn't defended herself with that line. Diane folded her hands on the table. Her answer didn't come right away, because if she told the truth, she would have to admit something people who trust systems often don't understand. Knowing the rule doesn't always mean you can beat the person holding the file. She had the clause. Sandra had the authority to interpret it. She had the 911 call. Apex had the incident report. She had the truth. But the truth of a night shift worker needed somebody else to confirm it before it was treated like evidence. Finally, Diane said she needed a witness, not a lawyer. Nicholas heard that like a lesson money couldn't buy. He didn't try to make himself the center of it. He said he could testify as a direct witness. Diane looked at him more carefully. She didn't fully trust him, but at least she could see that he hadn't come to make noise. He had come to put the papers on the table, to make sure what she had done couldn't be turned by Sandra into recklessness. They sat together for almost 40 minutes. Diane gave the sequence of events, brief and clean like a log entry, left the booth at 1:19, heard an impact, observed the alley, called 911, intervened, waited until police were close, then returned to her post. Nicholas wrote down a few details but didn't interrupt. She could tell he wasn't used to listening without steering the conversation, but he was trying. Before they left the shop, Nicholas asked whether she wanted him to pick her up for the hearing. Diane refused right away. She would get there herself. He nodded and didn't ask again. At the door, she looked back for a moment and saw him still standing beside the table, carefully gathering the papers into the folder. For the first time since the HR email came in, Diane didn't feel like she was walking into Monday morning completely empty-handed. Monday morning, the Apex hearing room was colder than it needed to be. It sat behind Sandra's office, a long room with a gray conference table and a recorder placed in the middle. On the wall hung the company's core values: professionalism, responsibility, safety. Diane looked at those three words and thought they could become a shelter or a weapon, depending on who was holding the pen. Sandra sat with an HR representative and a regional supervisor. In front of her was a file arranged in a very clean order: the official warning, the insurance email, the clipped camera footage of Diane leaving the booth, and Sandra's report about noncompliance. Diane sat across from them, her uniform ironed straight, her hair in a low bun, her hand resting on the stack of papers Nicholas had given her. She had dropped Jordan off at Mrs. Ellis's early that morning. Before she left, the boy had only asked if she would be home in time for dinner. Diane said she would try. Nicholas arrived 3 minutes before the hearing began. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a plain white shirt, sleeves rolled once, his wrist bare with no watch. He sat in the back row, not next to Diane, not next to Sandra, only as a witness in the true sense. But Nicholas didn't look at Sandra. He looked down at the copy of the police report in his hand. The hearing began in HR's voice. They read the date, time, employee ID, and complaint. Sandra presented first. She said Diane had left her guard post for 11 minutes without direct approval, leaving the primary position unmonitored and creating risk heat for the client in Apex. She mentioned the insurance company the way someone mentions a court higher than human decency. Then Diane was invited to present her side. She didn't tell a long story. She said she heard an impact and a person being threatened nearby, called 911 before leaving the booth, intervened to prevent bodily harm, and returned to her position once police arrived. She placed the printed procedure on the table and pointed to the 50-meter exception. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't shake. The HR representative asked whether there was evidence of the sound or the call before Diane left her post. Diane handed over a copy of the police report, but it only confirmed the call. It didn't sync with the Apex camera system. Sandra caught that gap very quickly. She said no one was denying that there had been a call, but the question was whether leaving the post had truly been necessary, whether it was within range, and whether it had been triggered by a situation inside the assigned zone. Nicholas stood when it was his turn. He didn't talk about money, and he didn't identify himself as anything beyond his full name. He confirmed that he was the person attacked in the alley and that if Diane hadn't stepped in, the situation could have escalated. He described how she had called the police first, warned the suspects, and stood between him and 3 men even though she had no idea who he was. His words shifted the room slightly, but Sandra could still call them the account of a grateful victim, not operational data. The door opened just as HR was preparing to move toward a preliminary conclusion. Jerome Harris stood in the doorway, breathing a little hard, holding a stack of printouts and a small USB drive. He wore his Apex uniform, his name badge slightly crooked, his eyes avoiding Sandra for the first second before turning back. Jerome asked to add system data. HR frowned but allowed it because he worked in shift monitoring. Sandra looked at him with eyes that could cut next month's overtime out of his schedule. Jerome placed the papers on the table. The printout showed the timeline from the alley audio system and the side door camera. The first impact sound had been recorded at 1:18:57. Diane stood up at 1:18:59. The 911 call began at 1:19:06. The side door opened at 1:21. The distance from the booth to the mouth of the alley was 47 meters according to the site map. No one spoke for a few seconds. The numbers did what Diane's account hadn't been allowed to do. They stood on the table without asking anyone to believe them. Jerome said very little. He only confirmed that he had pulled the data from the original system, with access logs, and that it could be verified. Then he placed the procedure manual open to the exception page, along with the site map printed from the client file. The 50-meter radius was circled in red. The mouth of the alley sat inside that circle. Diane looked at those pages, her throat tightening, not because she was weak, but because someone inside the system had finally agreed to say what the system itself had seen. Sandra responded by adjusting her glasses. She said the new data needed to be verified and that no one wanted to ignore procedure just because of emotion. But the sentence was weaker now. The HR representative took the USB and asked internal tech to run a quick metadata check. The 15-minute wait felt as long as a night shift. Diane sat still. Nicholas stayed in the back row. Jerome stood near the wall, both hands folded in front of him, not looking at Sandra. The verification came back by internal email. Valid logs, unaltered data. The radius fell within the assigned area. The 911 call happened before Diane left the main guard post, and the Apex manual allowed that action if the officer assessed a direct threat to life. Layer by layer, the truth opened in an order no one in the room could deny. First came the procedure line Nicholas had brought, proving Diane hadn't made up the right to intervene. Then came Jerome's third-party voice, a man who gained nothing by standing against Sandra but still placed the timestamps on the table. Finally came the full scale of the record. Camera, audio, 911, the 50-meter map, all of it matching. It wasn't vague kindness anymore. It was an action that was right both morally and procedurally. HR withdrew the official warning. The termination proposal was canceled. Diane's file was corrected to say emergency response, not unauthorized abandonment of post. Apex also had to send a revised report to the insurance company stating that the officer had activated 911 and intervened within the permitted area. Diane kept her job. Jordan's insurance remained. Sandra gathered her papers slowly. When she reached the door, she stopped but didn't look at Diane. She said she had acted according to what she had read. If the procedure had a gap, that wasn't her fault. It wasn't an apology. It was the last door of someone who didn't want to see the human being behind the claws. Then she left back straight, her heels hard against the linoleum. Jerome stayed for one more beat. He didn't ask Diane to forgive him with some big speech. He only said he should have brought the data forward sooner. Diane looked at him. She knew fear didn't make someone evil, but silence could make evil lighter, easier to keep carrying. She nodded once, no hug, no drama. Just enough for Jerome to understand that making it right was a first step, not the end. In the hallway, Nicholas waited beside the vending machine. Diane came out with the new file in her hands, the paper withdrawing the warning on top. She thanked him for coming. Nicholas said she had stepped in front of him without knowing who he was, and today he had only done the bare minimum. He didn't say it like flirtation. That was why it touched Diane more deeply. She was too used to people turning one small thing into a claim for credit. She looked at him more carefully. He had come alone. Just no assist, no suit, no watch. Nicholas glanced down at his bare wrist, almost embarrassed. He said he hadn't wanted her to think he was trying to buy the hearing. Diane didn't laugh out loud, but the corner of her mouth softened for the first time in days. He had heard what she hadn't said outright. A woman like her could accept evidence, but she didn't want to be turned into a rich man's charity project. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It held something new, very fragile, like the sky after rain, before anyone dares to call it sunlight. Diane held the file against her chest and remembered she hadn't eaten anything since morning, except half a piece of toast Jordan had left behind. Nicholas asked if she was hungry. She looked at him, then said there was a place nearby where she usually ate. The barbecue place sat on Malcolm X Boulevard, its glass window painted with red letters, ceiling fans turning slowly, the smell of smoke clinging to your clothes the moment you stepped inside. Diane ordered first, small ribs, baked beans, cornbread, and sweet tea. Nicholas stood behind her, reading the menu like it was written in a language simpler than every wine list he had ever known. When it was time to pay, he pulled out a card. Diane saw it but didn't argue, not because she accepted being bought, because he had sat in the back row during the hearing, hadn't made noise, and had used his presence as a witness instead of a wallet. This dinner she allowed him to pay. They sat at a table near the window. At first, they talked about the hearing, about Jerome, about the likelihood that Sandra would never admit she was wrong. Then the conversation moved into smaller things. Diane told him Jordan loved science, hated broccoli, and had once tried to fix a table fan with tape. Nicholas told her he built hotels but didn't know how to fix a sink, and that the last time he had walked alone through a city was years ago. Diane didn't pity him for that. She only listened, then asked a question sharp enough that he had to become more honest. The restaurant closed at 9:30. Employees started turning chairs upside down on the tables. Nicholas and Diane stepped outside. The Dallas night air felt cooler than inside the restaurant. At the curb, passing headlights lit their faces, then let them fall dark again. Nicholas stood beside her car and took a few seconds before asking whether she would want to see him again. Diane's hand stopped on the car door. She looked at him. Not at a billionaire, and not entirely at the man from the alley either. She looked at someone who was trying to learn how to come closer without taking up too much space. She asked how many times he had asked that question in his life. Nicholas didn't dodge it. He said never. That answer made Diane quiet longer than she meant to be. Then she opened the car door. Before getting in, she said she took her son to the park on Saturdays. If he wanted to come, he could come. No promise, no music swelling, no beautiful lights. Just a small door opening, wide enough for one person if he truly knew how to step slowly. Saturday morning, the small park in Oak Cliff lit up under a kind of sunlight that wasn't too bright, just enough to make the wooden benches less cold and turn the dew on the grass into a faint shimmer. Diane Carter arrived 15 minutes early. She spread an old blanket under an oak tree, set a bag of snacks beside it, then watched Jordan run toward the swings as if the past week had never held an HR email, a hearing file, or fear of losing her job hanging over their heads. The scratch on Diane's elbow, the small scrape from the night in Deep Ellum, had closed. Only a thin pink line remained, almost too small to matter. But Jordan still glanced at it when she took off her light jacket. The boy didn't ask, just like he hadn't asked the morning Diane came home late. He only checked with his eyes, then turned away when he saw his mother was all right. Nicholas Hart arrived exactly on time. No driver, no assistant, no shiny black car. He drove a silver rental SUV, the kind of car that could blend into any family parking lot on a weekend. He wore a light blue polo, dark jeans, and sneakers so new that Diane guessed he must have asked somebody what to wear to a park. That small awkwardness made her drop her guard a little more. Jordan recognized him from a distance. The boy didn't run over to say hello. He only looked at Nicholas, looked at the SUV, then turned straight back toward the swings. Diane saw all of it, but she didn't call her son over. Children have the right to keep their distance before deciding who gets to step into their space. Nicholas walked to the edge of the blanket and stopped at a proper distance. He greeted Diane first, then greeted Jordan, even though the boy hadn't looked back yet. Diane pointed to the bench beside the swings. Nicholas understood and went over, sitting down not too close. He didn't try to ask what grade Jordan was in, didn't talk about hotels, didn't promise ice cream, didn't act too familiar too fast. He only sat there, both hands on his knees, watching the boy swing back and forth. Jordan let the silence stretch for almost 5 minutes. Then, in the middle of one high swing, he asked Nicholas if he knew how to fix cars. Nicholas answered honestly that he didn't. Jordan dragged his feet on the ground to slow the swing and looked at him like he had just discovered a serious flaw. Then he asked what Nicholas could do. Nicholas thought for a second, then said he built hotels. Jordan frowned. That was clearly not as useful as fixing cars, fans, or outlets. After a while, Jordan pointed to the oak tree beside the grass and asked if Nicholas knew how to build a birdhouse. He wanted to hang one on the low branch where there was light, but cats couldn't climb up. Nicholas looked at the tree, then at Diane in the distance. He didn't say he could hire someone to do it. He didn't say he could buy a better one. He only admitted he had never built one, but he could learn. Jordan considered that answer, then began explaining, very seriously, the size of the entrance hole, where the roof should go, what kind of bird might come, and what needed drainage holes if it rained. Diane sat on the blanket and watched her son pull a hotel billionaire into a birdhouse discussion with the seriousness of a 9-year-old contractor. Nicholas listened closely. He asked only a little, but he asked in the right places. Jordan drew shapes in the air with his hands, pointed to the branch, measured the height with his eyes. At one point, the boy forgot the man in front of him had once appeared on Google. He only saw an adult who wasn't pretending to understand and wasn't laughing at his idea. That moment softened something in Diane's chest. Not because Nicholas was rich, and definitely not because he could buy anything Jordan wanted. Because he didn't use the ability to buy as a way to skip learning how to stay. After years of handling everything on her own, Diane realized she was touched by very small things. Someone arriving on time, sitting still, listening to her son finish a sentence. After a while, Jordan ran to the slide, leaving Nicholas and Diane under the shade of the tree. Nicholas stood beside her, not sitting down right away, as if waiting for permission. Diane gave a small nod toward the patch of grass beside her. He sat, keeping enough space that neither of them had to pretend to be comfortable. Diane asked why he had been walking alone that night. The question came without an introduction, but Nicholas didn't seem surprised. He looked toward Jordan climbing the slide and said that earlier that night he had argued with Malcolm, his assistant, about the schedule being too tight, about always having someone beside him, about feeling like he couldn't remember the last time he had crossed a street on his own without somebody opening a door first. He had been angry. He had told everyone to leave him alone, then walked by himself as a way of proving he still had control over his own life. He didn't speak for long, but each sentence was harder than the one before it. He admitted that he had grown up in a world where danger was usually blocked by other people before it ever touched him. Deep Ellum was the first time in years he understood that his safety wasn't some natural fact of the world. It was something bought, arranged, hired, and protected by people who often weren't remembered by name. Diane listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't tell him he should be grateful for his life. She didn't turn his fear into a moral lesson. Nicholas turned toward her, a little surprised by that silence. He said Diane wasn't asking if he was okay. Diane looked him up and down, then said he looked okay. The answer made him let out a quiet laugh, the first one that didn't sound like a business smile. He said people usually ask that so they would have a reason to keep talking. Diane shrugged. She had worked security for 8 years. She knew when people needed to talk and when they only needed somebody not to leave. That sentence stayed between them, needing no further explanation. Nicholas looked down at his hands used to signing contracts and shaking for cameras, then at Diane's hands, the hands that had pushed him away from the alley wall. He had searched for her because he wanted to know that person was real. Now he understood something more. Diane didn't need him to turn what she had done into something grand. She only needed him not to make it smaller by calling it luck or impulse. A few weeks later, Nicholas gave Diane another folder, but this time it wasn't to save her job. He had worked with a community organization in South Dallas and Oak Cliff to create a vocational scholarship program for young people who wanted to study professional security, building maintenance, hotel management, first aid, and evening paralegal courses. Diane read to the end before she saw the name of the fund, the Deep Ellum Community Safety Fund. Nicholas's name wasn't on it. Diane's name wasn't on it. He said it should carry the name of the place that had shown both of them who the other really was. Diane sat for a long time with the folder in her hands. She had grown up in South Dallas. She had once had a law scholarship, once believed she would learn how to use words to protect people like her. Then her life had turned into night shifts, bills, and uniforms. The fund didn't give her back her 20s. But it opened a door for other young people so they wouldn't have to give everything up just because of 1 month's rent. Diane didn't cry. She only set the folder down and asked Nicholas whether he had asked the community what it needed, or only asked the lawyers. He handed her a list of neighborhood meetings, the names of local advisors, and notes from a vocational training organization in Oak Cliff. She read them, then nodded. That was when Nicholas understood he had done it better this time. Not by giving a bigger gift, but by not putting his name on it. 3 months later, Nicholas came to Diane's apartment for the first time. He brought wood, screws, sandpaper, a brand new toolkit, and the face of a man who had watched too many tutorial videos the night before. Jordan opened the door before Diane could step out. The boy looked at the supplies, his eyes lighting up, then shouted that he had come to build the birdhouse. Nicholas nodded, serious as if he had arrived to sign the biggest contract of his life. Diane stood in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a towel, watching Jordan pull Nicholas into the living room. The apartment was still small. The refrigerator still had bills and school calendars on it. But the air inside had changed. Not because a rich man had stepped in, because someone had stepped in without making the room feel poorer. Jordan spread the birdhouse drawing across the table. Nicholas leaned down to listen to every instruction. When he glanced over the boy's shoulder, Diane was standing in the doorway wearing a very slight smile, no longer bracing the way she had in the early days. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no big promises yet, no ring, no music. Just wood, screws, a child who wanted to build a home for birds, and 2 adults learning how to trust kindness without rushing to name it. That afternoon, when the birdhouse was mounted near the kitchen window, Jordan wrote his name on the back, then let Nicholas hammer the last nail. Diane didn't say anything. She only stood there, listening to the small sound of the hammer inside an apartment that had once been too quiet. To her, that sound felt like a very ordinary promise. Someone would come back not to fix her, but to help finish one more thing that hadn't been done. If this story leaves one image with me, it isn't Nicholas Hart in an expensive suit, and it isn't the moment Diane won the hearing. What I remember most is the second she stepped into the alley, putting her body in front of a stranger while she herself was still calculating whether she had enough money to get gas and go home. Some great choices aren't born from abundance. They're born from something very simple, seeing someone in danger and being unable to look away. Diane wasn't saved by Nicholas. That needs to be said clearly. She was already brave before she knew who he was. She did the right thing before there was a witness, before there was a community fund, before anyone powerful enough could confirm that she had been right. What Nicholas brought wasn't value to Diane. He was simply the first person in this story to look at what she had done and ask why she had to pay for it, instead of asking which clause she had violated. That's rarer than money. Money can pay bills, but being seen correctly can give a person back the feeling that they weren't crazy for choosing kindness. Diane had lived for years in a world that made her prove every minute away from her chair, every bruise, and every reason she came home late. Nicholas, by standing as a witness instead of a benefactor, gave her something she rarely received. Someone standing beside her truth without trying to own it. There's a lesson for Nicholas, too. He grew up inside safety so well organized that he forgot who made the world around him safe. Deep Ellum made him understand that courage doesn't always wear a suit, doesn't come with bodyguards, and doesn't stand on a charity stage spotlight. Sometimes it wears an old security uniform, holds a phone calling 911, shakes on the inside, and still steps forward. Sandra called what Diane did, leaving her post. Diane called it seeing someone who needed help. Those two ways of naming it show how we see each other. If we only look through the procedure, we can miss the human beings. But if we only look through emotion, justice can be pushed aside too. That is why truth needs both courage and evidence. Diane had the action, Jerome had the timestamp, Nicholas had the testimony, and when those three stood together, kindness could no longer be called a violation. Have you ever stood up for someone, not because you would gain anything, but because you knew that if you didn't, they would be completely alone? Or has someone ever stood in front of you in a moment you never forgot? If so, tell that story. Maybe that person doesn't need to be called a hero, but people who have done the right thing in silence deserve to have their names spoken at least once somewhere someone is willing to listen. And if you're living like Diane, always having to be strong for your child, for the bills, for the job, for the night shifts no one sees, I hope you remember this. Your kindness isn't small just because it happened in a dark alley. Your courage isn't worth less just because you were wearing a hired uniform. One day the right person will see you, not to save you from yourself, but to stand beside you and say what you did was right.